Hi, everyone, and welcome to our 2019 First Quarter Outlook webinar from Informa Pharma Intelligence. My name is Dominique Fontanilla, and I am the Therapeutic Area Director for CNS and Immunology and Inflammation Diseases. Today, I'm joined by Michael Haydock, our Therapeutic Area Director for Infectious Diseases and Cardiovascular and Metabolic Diseases.
Hi, everybody.
Michael. And also Hardik Patel, who is our Therapeutic Area Director of Oncology and Respiratory Diseases.
Hi, everyone.
I also wanted to let everyone know that we will be making the slides and recording available to you after the presentation. But for today's webinar, Michael, Hardik, and I will take you through some key catalysts we wanted to highlight that are expected this quarter, as well as their potential impact on pharma markets. I should also mention that this webinar is accompanied by our early 2019 Outlook report from Biomed Tracker and Med Device Tracker, which covers key catalysts from 23 drugs and numerous large impact catalysts through early 2019. So if you're interested in that, it is available for download on our website. But to go through our agenda today, I will be speaking about key catalysts with Spravato, which is in development for major depressive disorder, followed by Mayzent in multiple sclerosis, and finally Jazz Pharmaceuticals' solriamfetol for the treatment of narcolepsy. Michael will then review highlights for ResVax in RSV and oral semaglutide for type 2 diabetes, in addition to Amgen's Evenity in osteoporosis. And then last but not least, Hardik will be taking us through some oncology highlights, which include enfortumab vedotin for bladder cancer, Tecentriq in triple-negative breast cancer, and small cell lung cancer, and Cyramza for hepatocellular cancer. So, as I mentioned, I'll start off by speaking about Johnson & Johnson's Spravato. It's also known as esketamine. This drug is an S enantiomer of the recreational drug ketamine, and it was developed after previous data showed that ketamine had a rapid and large antidepressant effect. This is an inhaled intranasal formulation of Spravato as a potential adjunctive treatment for major depressive disorder patients who don't respond adequately to conventional antidepressants. So this quarter, Spravato has a target PDUFA date of March 4, which is coming up very soon for major depressive disorder, and chances are quite high for approval with a Biomed Tracker LOA of 93%, which is about 8% above average. This FDA application is based on the results from a series of 3 phase 3 trials called Transform, testing Spravato for the acute treatment of adults with major depressive episodes. And then patients who complete these studies are eligible to enter the SUSTAIN clinical program measuring Spravato's effect on preventing relapses as well as long-term safety. So the interesting thing here is that Spravato has had really mixed results and failed to meet the primary endpoints in the Transform 1 and Transform 3 trials. In addition, about 10% of patients in the trials experienced some treatment-associated adverse events, such as nausea, dissociation, dizziness, and headache. And KOLs that we interviewed were most concerned with the dissociative side effects, because that may increase the potential for abuse, as well as something that they noticed, which is an increase in blood pressure during treatment with Spravato. So those were the main concerns. However, despite failing to meet these primary endpoints in Transform 1 and 3, Spravato did really well in the phase 3 Transform 2 trial. It demonstrated a significant reduction in the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale versus placebo after 28 days of treatment. And in addition, Spravato demonstrated a superior remission rate versus placebo, 52.5% versus 31%, which is really appealing from a clinical perspective. So although there are mixed results, the high unmet need And this patient population who have treatment-resistant depression is notorious for being very hard to treat. The rapid onset of action, which has been well documented, especially with off-label use of ketamine, is a very attractive feature to treating physicians as well as patients. We've seen this as a recurring theme in many of the FDA advisory committee meetings, such as the ones for Sage 217 and Zulresso, and postpartum depression and MDD last year. And so KOLs are quite keen to use this as an important tool to help their depression patients. So if approved, Spravato would provide the first new mechanism of action in 30 years, really, to treat this debilitating mental illness. And Data Monitor Healthcare forecasts the drug to do quite well, making almost $2 billion in revenue by 2026. KOLs that we spoke to initially expect the uptake of Spravato to occur in later lines of therapy, since this will be a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. And then additional label expansions are also expected to boost sales, and they include depression with imminent risk of suicide, as well as pediatric patients with imminent risk of suicide. I should also mention that Allergan is developing Repastinel, which is chemically different from ketamine, but also acts as an NMDA antagonist. We expect that for the most part, it will help to grow the depression market alongside Spravato in the NMDA class, rather than compete with it. Top-line phase 3 data have yet to come out, so we're looking forward to that. And although Repastinel is not forecast to enter the market until 2020, and also potentially not in Europe, we still forecast it to reach over $1 billion in revenue by the end of the forecast period. So for Spravato, there are some potential barriers that we foresee, including a potential price premium, a REMS program, and a rather inconvenient formulation. Not so much the intranasal formulation, but that it because that's quite convenient, but it's anticipated that patients will have to be monitored in a hospital setting or clinic setting for up to 2 hours after treatment, just to make sure that any dissociative side effects or increased blood pressure effects have subsided before patients are allowed to return home. But nevertheless, the drug is expected to do quite well. I guess before I move on, Michael and Hardik, did you have any questions?
I have one question, Dominique. You mentioned that Johnson & Johnson could price Spravato at a premium, given that it's meeting some unmet needs, but do you think that there's a scenario where they might opt to price it a little bit more conservatively in hopes that it'll encourage uptake despite some of these drawbacks that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what Johnson & Johnson will price it at. So there's no example really that we can benchmark off of for pricing for Spravato. But as you mentioned, there are reasons why J&J would price Spravato at a premium. First of all, as I mentioned, it has a novel mechanism of action, and it will definitely be able to help fulfill this unmet need to treat treatment-resistant depression. And obviously, it would be in the company's best interest to take advantage of as much value as it can. However, there are places known as ketamine clinics where patients can pay out of pocket for off-label ketamine IV infusions. And pricing at these clinics is actually really expensive. It's around $650 to $1,200 per treatment. And patients need around 6 to 8 treatments at the start. So if we're talking about pricing the drug more conservatively than off-label ketamine clinics, and considering it's an intranasal formulation, which should be offered at a discount compared to the intravenous infusions, then yes, it probably will be priced more conservatively. Also, there's a chance of conservative pricing if the company bears in mind that the drug is used as an adjunctive treatment to antidepressants and not as a monotherapy. So that will be an added cost on top of their antidepressant. Any other questions?
Sure, I can jump in with one, Dominique. I was wondering, is treatment with Spravato expected to be indefinite? And if not, what are the criteria for stopping treatment? And are there any studies that assess the impact of stopping treatment in people who've shown a good response?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Spravato is, as I mentioned, Spravato is being developed as an adjunct treatment to newly introduced antidepressant treatment and not as a monotherapy. And until recently, there wasn't a lot of long-term efficacy and safety data. But with the SUSTAIN trials, as I mentioned, the long-term safety of Spravato treatment at 56 weeks seems reasonably fine. And it has also demonstrated that it's been able to delay relapse in significantly more patients in the Spravato arm compared to placebo. And this was using Spravato intermittently, but beyond 16 weeks of treatment. So in terms of safety, there's no alarming signal so far regarding long-term intermittent use. But Spravato's clinical efficacy has a rapid onset and it lasts up to 7 days. So I think it makes sense that it's used with another antidepressant, perhaps on an as-need basis. I think the hope with Spravato would be that it's able to provide relief quickly from depression until the oral antidepressant that they're also newly introduced to starts to kick in, because it takes such a long time, sometimes at least 4 weeks. So yeah, I don't think it'll be indefinite, but I think they use it intermittently as an as-need basis.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I guess. So next, I wanted to touch on Novartis's Mayzent. Mayzent is also known as siponimod from Novartis, and it has a target PDUFA date also in March of this year. This drug is a sphingosine 1 phosphate receptor agonist, and it has specific selectivity for the sphingosine 1 phosphate 1 and sphingosine 1 phosphate 5 receptor subtypes. Right now, it's looking very promising for Mayzent with a biomed tracker LOA of 87%, which is 4% above average. So just to put this into context, this will be Novartis's second offering in the multiple sclerosis market, the first being Gilenya, which was the first sphingosine 1 phosphate modulator to be approved for MS in 2010. And that's targeting the relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis patients, which is the most common form of the disease. So it's no surprise that Gilenya has been a blockbuster star for Novartis, and it brought in $3.2 billion in sales in 2017. And so Novartis is attempting to position Mayzent in a way that it'll be differentiated from Gilenya and not affect its wider multiple sclerosis portfolio, especially since Gilenya will be facing presumably very aggressive generic erosion this year in Europe. In the U.S., the USPTO upheld a dose patent last year for Gilenya, which in theory extends the drug's exclusivity until 2027. But depending on the outcomes of other legal disputes that are going on, the patent cliff can enter in the U.S. as soon as 2022. So Mayzent's target patient population is different from Gilenya's. It is secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, which is currently an area of high unmet need since there's no standard of care for these patients. The vast majority of patients with relapse-remitting MS will eventually transition to secondary progressive MS, where their disease worsens without having frequent relapses. And then this, as well as primary progressive MS, which accounts for around 10 to 15% of MS patients, are a very, very hard to treat patient populations, and more treatment options are needed for these progressive types. So this NDA filing is based on positive results from the phase 3 EXPAND trial, and it was testing Mayzent monotherapy in around 1,600 patients between the ages of 18 and 60 who already had established secondary progressive MS. Mayzent reached the trial's primary endpoint, showing a statistically significant risk reduction in confirmed disability progression of 21% at 3 months compared to placebo. And then at 6 months, treatment with Mayzent reduced the risk of 6-month disability progression by 26% as compared to placebo. With other secondary endpoints, there were also favorable outcomes in other relevant measures of multiple sclerosis disease activity. However, in terms of improvements in a patient's ability to walk, though, Mayzent failed to show a statistically significant difference in a walk test versus placebo, so it doesn't help patients in that way. So far, interestingly enough, there have been mixed reactions to the data presented. In the final data that was published, for example, in the Lancet, an accompanying commentary was also published in the journal. And it found the treatment effect to be very modest. But others have also really touted this data, emphasizing that the EXPAND trial was tested in exclusively secondary progressive patients, which is quite unique. And so the results are actually quite strong if you take that into account. So ultimately, the EXPAND trial, which was done in a large number of patients, met its primary endpoint. And so I think the likelihood of approval is warranted in this case. I guess before I move on, any questions?
Just one question for me, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It was about the rationale for using placebo as the comparator in the EXPAND study. I guess you alluded to the fact that there's no established standard of care. But is there anything else approved or any other off-label therapies that are frequently used that it could have been compared against? So will payers see placebo as an acceptable comparator, I guess, is the question I'm getting at.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, as I mentioned, there's no standard of care for the treatment of secondary progressive MS. So I do think that using placebo in this patient population is a relevant comparator. I guess if Novartis had chosen to focus more on relapse-remitting MS, then yes, there would be a reason to use an active comparator. But as I mentioned, the EXPAND trial was unique in that it was only enrolling secondary progressive patients, and so placebo here I think is acceptable. Interestingly, I think there's been several barriers hindering drug development in progressive MS, and the first is that defining progression in this clinical setting is really challenging. Secondly, the underlying disease mechanisms are not very well known for these progressive types. For example, in relapse-remitting MS and in secondary progressive MS with relapses, it's known that there's inflammatory events that play roles in the neurological symptoms and disease progression. And so that's why disease-modifying therapies reduce the frequency and severity of relapses. But they don't work so well with progressive MS patients that don't experience relapse or have inflammatory events. And these mechanisms are largely unknown. For example, Roche's anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody Ocrevus was recently approved, but that was approved for primary progressive MS. So that suggests an involvement of B cells in that subtype. But then again, these mechanisms really need to be further elucidated. So I do think it's been really very difficult to get therapies through for these progressive types, but I do think that placebo here fits the bill. Anything else?
No, nothing from me.
Okay. So finally, I wanted to discuss solriamfetol from Jazz Pharmaceuticals. It's a phenylalanine derivative that targets dopamine and noradrenaline receptors. And Jazz is developing this drug for the treatment of excessive sleepiness associated with narcolepsy, as well as obstructive sleep apnea. We are expecting FDA decisions on the application next month with a target PDUFA date for both indications on March 20th. And so far, the data look very promising, registering a 4% above average likelihood of approval, bringing it to 87%. So if approved, this will be the first drug of its class to be approved for treating excessive sleepiness associated with narcolepsy and obstructive sleep apnea, and the first new drug class in these indications in a decade. There are 4 phase 3 trials called TONES 2 through 5, which are supporting solriamfetol's NDA filing in both of these indications. In the TONES 5 study, for which the final data came out last year, the main goal of the trial was to look more closely at long-term safety and maintenance of that efficacy, and also to determine the change in the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. During a 2-week randomized withdrawal after 6 months of treatment with solriamfetol compared to placebo. And this was completed in a group of 280 patients. So patients who received solriamfetol for 6 months were randomly withdrawn from treatment, and they showed consistent improvement with a mean change in the sleepiness scale of 1.6 versus a larger 5.3 change in patients who received placebo. And this demonstrates long-term maintenance of the efficacy with solriamfetol in excessively sleepy patients with narcolepsy or obstructive sleep apnea. In addition, participants who received solriamfetol showed sustained reductions in mean sleepiness scale scores and improvements on the patient and clinical global impression of change scales for up to a year. So the safety concerns with this drug were also very minimal, and then the treatment was tolerable for patients. So overall, this data shows that solriamfetol is able to increase alertness in these patients who otherwise have continued sleepiness when on other treatments. If this gains approval, this is likely to boost Jazz Pharmaceuticals' sleep franchise because more options, especially with new mechanisms of action, are needed to treat excessive sleepiness due to narcolepsy and obstructive sleep apnea, which are really very debilitating conditions that impair cognitive function, safety, productivity, and overall give these patients a lower quality of life. Xyrem is Jazz's flagship product and its first offering in its sleep portfolio. It accounts for around 75% of its sales, making it really the top revenue generator for the company. Currently, Xyrem has pretty broad coverage in this space, and it's approved to treat cataplexy associated with narcolepsy, as well as excessive sleepiness and narcolepsy in both adults and pediatric patients. But since Xyrem's patents are set to expire in 2023, it's thought that solriamfetol will be the next generation Xyrem, helping the company to avoid such a large patent cliff since solriamfetol has shown better efficacy and safety than Xyrem and other largely genericized drugs already on the market. So that's all from me in case you had any questions.
Just one quick question from me on that one, Dominique, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Are there other indications that are associated with excessive sleepiness besides narcolepsy and sleep apnea that you think this drug could possibly go for in the future?
Yeah, definitely. Jazz Pharmaceuticals has actually already progressed solriamfetol into phase 2 development for excessive daytime sleepiness associated with Parkinson's disease. And actually the first top-line data for that trial is expected between now and the end of April, so that'll be really interesting to see. In addition, there are other conditions in which are associated with excessive sleepiness, such as chronic shift work sleep disorder. So those are definitely possibilities where solriamfetol could potentially expand into.
Thank you.
Yeah. If that's all, then I will leave it up. Hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Dominique. Hi again, everyone. I'm going to discuss a few catalysts in the infectious disease space and also the metabolic space. But to start with my first catalyst, this is ResVax. It's an RSV fusion protein nanoparticle vaccine being developed by Novavax. So or for the maternal immunization of pregnant women. It's also being developed for the elderly and for pediatric patients. The pediatric population is still in phase 1. The elderly population was in phase 3. Unfortunately, a pivotal trial failed, and so that's now been moved back to phase 2, which has made the first indication that's likely to be approved in pregnant women. So the catalyst that we're expecting this quarter is an interim analysis from the PREPARE phase 3 study. This is the one in third trimester pregnant women, and it has a primary endpoint of a reduction in the incidence of medically attended LRTIs, or lower respiratory tract infections, in the first 3 months and possibly up to the first 6 months, depending how long the antibodies that are transferred through the placenta to infants are capable of providing protection. But to give a bit of background context, because I'm aware many people may never even have heard of RSV, there is, despite its relatively unknown nature, particularly in the general public, there is a very large unmet need for vaccines capable of reducing the burden of severe RSV infection. So it's a respiratory infection that the largest burden is in infants and the elderly. So it's actually the leading cause of bronchiolitis and pneumonia in children aged under 1 year. And in the US, the CDC estimates it causes 177,000 hospitalizations in the elderly each year and 14,000 deaths. So it's a pretty extensive cause of morbidity and mortality, but relatively awareness is pretty low. There are no vaccines that currently exist. There is, however, a prophylactic agent called Synagis or palivizumab. It's a monoclonal antibody. It's called a passive immunization agent because it's not a vaccine. It doesn't stimulate immunological memory. It reduces severe infection. It doesn't prevent initial infection of RSV, but it does reduce the likelihood of infections becoming severe. So at the moment, it's only approved for infants. However, it is very expensive and it has quite an inconvenient dosing schedule. You have to dose it once a month for the 5 months of the RSV season, and there's issues with compliance there. And because it's expensive, its use is limited to very niche risk groups in infants, particularly those who are born preterm, have congenital heart disease or chronic lung disease. So there's a lot of opportunity here, not only in the maternal space, but also for the elderly as well, for any vaccines capable of reducing the burden of RSV hospitalization and death. But specifically for the PREPARE study in pregnant women, it's looking pretty positive. There was an interim analysis released late last year, I believe, of roughly 1,300 infants who were born to pregnant women who had received the vaccine. And that interim analysis suggested efficacy was in the range of 45 to 100%. So quite a large range there. So we'll be intrigued to see actually where the numbers fall when it comes to the actual analysis that they'll release probably next month. So far, there's some phase 2 proof of concept data that have effectively shown that the vaccine is capable of inducing antibody responses against the RSV fusion protein, and that those antibodies are effectively transferred across the placenta to infants. However, I would say one of the potential concerns for this vaccine that we'll be looking for when the data are released is how long the antibodies are capable of providing protection for, because that's going to be a very big determinant of the premium that Novavax will be able to charge should this vaccine ever reach the market. So the half-life from earlier studies of the antibodies seem to be about 30 to 41 days. The burden is highest in infants in their first 3 months. However, those in their first 6 months are also considered at elevated risk. So ideally, the vaccine would be capable of protecting for the first 6 months when the risk is highest. So it could address a major unmet need, but its sales potential is very much determined by the duration of protection. So we'll wait to see exactly what sort of premium pricing the company might be able to charge based on the longevity of protection and, of course, also the extent of protection. Another big limiting factor here, and you can see the sales forecast that we have for this specific risk group in the US, Japan, and 5 EU. So this is just the maternal sales we're seeing here. Is low vaccination coverage in pregnant women. So we utilize, if you have a look at other vaccines, for example, influenza is probably a reasonably good comparison given it's also seasonal and pregnant women are currently recommended to receive it. If you look across the markets we're analysing, really you're hard pushed to get coverage above 40% or so. That's where it currently stands. So that is going to be one of the big limiting factors that will reduce the potential population for this, is actually just convincing pregnant women of the value of the vaccine, because understandably, many pregnant women are quite risk averse and don't want to administer vaccines if they're not completely convinced of the protective potential. So there will be a lot of education required there. And then other things, of course, with such a big unmet need, there are lots of rivals also developing vaccines within the RSV space. So probably the biggest rivals, one is being developed by GSK. It's a very similar design. It's also based on the F protein. However, it's a pre-fusion form. Effectively, there's a pre-fusion and a post-fusion form of this protein, and preclinical data in animal models suggests the pre-fusion form, which is what GSK is using, has the potential to be more immunogenic. Whether that leads to superior protection is yet to be seen, but that's certainly a potential threat from around 2023. And then another large threat as well is actually MEDI8897, which isn't a vaccine. It's effectively a successor to Synagis, which was the monoclonal antibody I mentioned earlier. And that could theoretically be administered as an at-birth dose and provide passive protection for the first 5 months or so of life. So that could be a quite significant threat as well. So I'll leave that one there for any questions.
Yeah, Michael, I had a quick question. So you mentioned that like these maternal vaccines are a bit risk averse. And then with this MEDI8897 could be given to infants. So how great a threat do you think that MEDI8897 poses to ResVax and other maternal vaccines?
I think it's quite a significant threat depending on how it's priced. So MEDI8897 it's a biologic, it's a monoclonal antibody, so you might expect it to be priced quite high comparably to Synagis. However, I would suggest that the company pursues vaccine-like pricing, and that's purely because there are so many vaccines in the pipeline that if vaccines were shown to be protective, it'd be quite hard to justify MEDI8897's price, given it would only protect particular risk groups of infants when you could actually protect a broader range of infants by using lower cost vaccines. However, if the company was to price it more comparably to vaccines, so low price, high volume strategy, I would say it's a very significant threat, because one of the key advantages that it could bring is because you could, vaccinate, you could immunize people with this antibody at birth, you could get much higher coverage rates than you could when you're trying to convince pregnant women to receive vaccination. So that's certainly one of the benefits. And then, of course, depending on the extent of protection that Novavax's vaccine is able to provide, there may be a benefit in using MEDI8897 instead, because they recently showed in a separate study in infants, MEDI8897 was shown to reduce the incidence of severe infection. So it does have proof of concept efficacy, and that is after a single dose. They haven't released the detailed data yet as to how long MEDI8897 actually persists in the body, but the ideal is for it to last at least the 5 months that Synagis currently covers. So again, it's really going to be a match up between the extent of protection in terms of the percent reduction in LRTIs, and also the longevity of protection that they provide.
Okay, thanks.
Assuming there's nothing else, I'll move on to my next catalyst, which is a very interesting diabetes drug called Semaglutide. It's actually an oral form, so this is produced by Novo Nordisk. And the reason I specify oral semaglutide is because actually semaglutide is already on the market, branded as Ozempic in injectable form. So currently all GLP-1 agonists, which is the class that this particular molecule belongs to, are injectable. And this will be the first oral formulation of this class. So what we're expecting either towards the end of this quarter or potentially into the next quarter, we're expecting Novo Nordisk to file for US and EU approval based on the Pioneer pivotal program, which was actually an extremely extensive program of 10 pivotal studies, which investigated oral semaglutide in a wide range of treatment settings. Particularly highlights, I would say, head-to-head studies against standard of care SGLT2 inhibitors, other GLP-1 injectable agents, and also DPP-4 agents. So they're the typical classes that are widely used across type 2 diabetes. And it had some very promising data in these head-to-head studies. So Victoza in, I think it was the Pioneer 4 study, it was compared against Victoza, which is actually Novo Nordisk's own once-daily GLP injectable that they have on the market, liraglutide. And it showed superior weight loss in the primary analysis and non-inferior glycemic efficacy. If you actually looked at the secondary analysis, which is limited to patients who remained on treatment, I believe it is actually superior to Victoza on both of those, but typically the FDA puts greater weight on the primary analysis or the intent to treat analysis. So it showed it was at least non-inferior to Victoza. It also showed superior glycemic efficacy versus Jardiance, which is the leading SGLT2 inhibitor. And it was also superior on both endpoints, so both weight and glycemic efficacy, against Januvia, which is one of the leading DPP-4 inhibitors. And these were all at the highest dose of oral semaglutide. I would say one of the downsides of using this higher dose, which is likely the one that they're seeking approval for, is that it does possess higher rates of nausea than the other classes, so the SGLT2s and the DPP-4s, but that's a well-known side effect of the injectable. So the nausea rates are actually quite comparable to what you see with the injectables. Another potential downside of this particular drug is it has quite stringent dosing requirements because you have to have quite a high dose of semaglutide because it's a peptide. You have to have quite a high oral dose and you need to make sure it's absorbed. And I believe the specifications you have to have, I think it's 120 milliliters of water when you wake up, and then you're not allowed, you have to take the tablet with water, and then you're not allowed to have any food for half an hour. So for many patients that will be fine, but in the real world scenario, if patients don't comply with that particular dosing recommendation, then of course its real world efficacy could be inferior to what we see in trials. So why is this drug important? You can see we've got a very high LOA here. It's above average by about 16% based on the data that I've shown. It's important for two reasons, really. Firstly, Novo Nordisk, as I mentioned, already have Victoza on the market, which is a once-daily injectable GLP-1 agonist. That's been losing share recently to Eli Lilly's once-weekly Trulicity. And recently, Novo Nordisk, as I mentioned, launched Ozempic, which is the injectable semaglutide. So that's already started to recapture share from Trulicity, which is its main rival, based on some SUSTAIN 7 data where it showed it was superior in terms of weight loss and glycemic efficacy. So depending where Novo Nordisk decides to position oral semaglutide, it could be an important additional growth driver if it starts to expand the reach of the GLP-1 agonists into earlier lines of therapy. Because the GLP-1 agonists are quite expensive and they're injectable, they tend to be reserved for later lines of therapy after the other oral classes that I've mentioned. So if this is priced appropriately, oral semaglutide could allow the GLP agonists to expand their role earlier into the treatment algorithm. So we've interviewed some key opinion leaders on this. As I said, Novo Nordisk has actually indicated, based on the cost of producing semaglutide, because of the high dose that's required, the actual cost of production is similar to the injectable. So they've indicated they might actually price it comparably to GLP-1 agonists. However, the key opinion leaders we've noted said they'd be quite surprised if Novo Nordisk took that approach, because if you price it as an oral drug and it's significantly higher price than other oral drugs that are frequently used earlier in the treatment algorithm, then payers may well they may require step therapy, so you may have to go through the other oral options before you can utilize oral semaglutide, and they might put up, formulary adverse formulary tierings, etc., to try and limit its use, particularly given its clinical data has been so positive. They may well have quite a defensive reaction there. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how they price it and where they position it. The downside of pricing it as an oral agent is because then presumably people who are on the more expensive injectable Ozempic would potentially move to the oral option, and that would lower Novo Nordisk's margins. So that's the rationale why they may price it as injectable, but it would greatly limit its share. And then I guess one final point I'd mention here is CVOTs, so cardiovascular outcome trials are becoming increasingly important in this setting. In particular, oral semaglutide will have a post-marketing CVOT. It's had a short pre-approval one, which just showed it was at least as safe as placebo, but going forward, they'll ideally show actually a reduction in MACE events, so major adverse cardiovascular events in the post-approval CVOT, and that will be very important for competing against the SGLT2 inhibitors, which have already shown good MACE reductions in their CVOTs, and they're also in development for heart failure, the SGLT2 inhibitors. So again, people with cardiovascular risk factors, CVOT data will be very important in terms of competition with the SGLT2 inhibitors. I'll leave that one there in the interest of time. Any questions at all before I move on to my next catalyst?
I think you answered all my questions, Michael, so I don't have any. Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, I'll move on to my last catalyst, which is Evenity for osteoporosis. This one has an extremely high likelihood of approval. It's 99%. We're actually expecting imminent approval for this in osteoporosis in the next few days. There was an AdCom in January where the panelists voted overwhelmingly in favor of its approval. However, Evenity has been dogged by an increased MACE risk that was observed in one of its studies, the ARCH study, I believe, reported a higher incidence of MACE events in the active arm of Evenity compared to its comparator arm. And that was a bit of a shock because the FRAME study, which they originally conducted, didn't show that at all. It showed a significant reduction in vertebral fractures, but it didn't show a significant reduction in non-vertebral fractures. And that's quite important because actually most of the costs are incurred by non-vertebral fractures. So it's very important for any drugs that are aimed at the high-risk population that obviously have premium price tags, that they do also reduce non-vertebral fractures. So Amgen also had an ARCH study, which enrolled patients who are even higher risk, so those are previous fractures. And in that study, they did show a statistical improvement in both vertebral and non-vertebral fractures. So the data were positive in the efficacy sense, but as I say, there was a CV safety signal that was thrown up in that latter study that really initially it delayed their application. They had to they got a CRL from the FDA and they had to resubmit data with a pooled safety analysis. So Amgen hopes to, with this drug, capture market share from Forteo, which is one of the leading anabolic agents that are currently used. They want to position it as a short 12-month treatment and ideally follow it with Prolia, which is one of their other drugs that's very successful, has blockbuster sales. So you do short-term treatment with Evenity and then follow that up with long-term treatment with Prolia, which would be great for Amgen because it would maintain the revenues and you'd have a constant flow of patients between one drug and the other. The reason you can't use agents like Forteo and Evenity for long treatment periods, particularly for Forteo, is because in rats, in preclinical models, there's increased risk of osteosarcoma. So the FDA doesn't recommend that you use these treatments for long periods of time. However, as I say, the CV risk is going to probably emerge as a black box warning if this drug is approved, as we expect, and that will quite significantly hamper its ability to compete with Tymlos, which is another recently approved agent that has been priced significantly lower than Forteo, has a very similar mode of action to Forteo and quite promising efficacy data. So it may well be that physicians, certainly for those patients who have existing cardiovascular risk factors, would prefer to go with Tymlos, given it's got a cleaner label. So you can see there's just a key opinion leader quote to that effect, that Tymlos may well be preferred. And I'll leave that there. Any questions at all for Evenity?
Just one quick question from me, Michael. Do you think any design or kind of outcomes that from the cardiovascular outcomes trial that's required as a post-marketing study for this drug, do you think any of those designs or outcomes could possibly impact the uptake of Evenity, or do you think because there are other drugs available that don't have cardiovascular issues that it's not really going to be much of an impact either way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say if the post-marketing CV study was positive and showed that actually this was a kind of one-off finding, or if it was able to better identify the patients who are at risk, because at the moment that also isn't very well elucidated. It's not entirely clear if CV risk is indeed a true signal here, actually who is most at risk. So if it could be either of those things, that would obviously be beneficial because it would help mitigate one of its disadvantages. That said, I would say part of why it's such an interesting question is because actually the FDA AdCom panel were very split over whether the the post-approval CV safety study should be randomized or if it should be observational. So those who are saying it should be randomized of the ideal from the being able to have a good comparator and actually show it. The problem with having a randomized study is that it would be pretty hard to recruit patients if you'd have to ideally enrich that with people who had cardiovascular risk factors, and that would be quite hard to recruit patients given it has a black box warning for CV risk. So just the practicality of conducting a randomized study would be quite tough. So the other option is to do an observational study, but again, one of the panelists actually said, well, if you're to do an observational study, you just prove it's safe from the outset, because if it has a risk factor, if it has a black box label for CV risk, in reality, how physicians are likely to use this drug is that they're not going to use it in patients who have CV risk factors. So you'd be massively biasing your study to exclude obviously patients who may well be affected by this hypothetical risk, and you would show it as safe just simply by the design of the study. So there's a bit of debate over exactly what study design the FDA will require. But yeah, certainly, obviously, a positive outcome would certainly help against Tymlos. One of the other factors I didn't mention as well is preference for dosing. So Tymlos is dosed once daily. It's a subcutaneous agent, whereas Evenity is dosed once monthly. However, for Evenity, just because the sheer large dose volume required, you have to go to a physician to administer it. So you've kind of got a trade-off there between having less frequent injections, but obviously the inconvenience of having to go to visit an office. And Tymlos, or abaloparatide, I believe its molecular name, is also being developed in a transdermal patch, which could, again, significantly increase that molecule's attractiveness to patients because it would avoid the need for having injections at all. And instead, it's just a patch that has micro needles in it that provides the active agent. So that could be quite an important threat coming forward. And I believe they're starting a phase 3 study for that subcutaneous patch this year. So we'll see. Maybe next year we might have some initial data from that study.
Cool.
But on that, Hardik, I think I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. The first oncology drug that I wanted to discuss is Informa vedotin, which is an antibody drug conjugate in development by Astellas and Seattle Genetics for urothelial bladder cancer. The results of Informab's phase 2 EV201 trial are expected by the end of this quarter, and if they're positive, the companies will likely use them to file for regulatory approval later on this year. Right now in bladder cancer, cisplatin-based chemotherapy is still the standard first-line treatment for patients who are eligible for it. The recent approvals of PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors for bladder cancer have helped kind of provide other treatment options for patients who are ineligible for cisplatin or who progress on chemotherapy, but there are very few other options following progression on PD-1 therapy, so there's both a pretty significant unmet need and a huge market opportunity for this particular treatment setting. Informa has shown previous activity in this population based on a phase 1 trial. In this phase 1 trial, there were 89 bladder cancer patients that had been previously treated with a PD-1 or PD-L1 inhibitor, and of those patients, about 40% responded to treatment, so a pretty high response rate there. And if the company is able to duplicate this response rate in the phase 2 EV201 trial, that should likely be enough for accelerated approval within the U.S. And they've also got a phase 3 trial already ongoing, which is fairly similarly designed to EV201, but does feature a comparator in that particular arm and will use overall survival as the primary endpoint. But if results of that phase 3 trial are positive, that should be helped to convert the accelerated approval in the U.S. to a full approval, as well as expand approval out to any other markets. But I think that's all I had on enfortumab. Any questions on that one in particular?
Yeah, I just had one question, Hardik. Are there any other antibody drug conjugate agents being developed for bladder cancer at all? And is that just a general trend in oncology? Is it specific to bladder cancer?
Yeah, for bladder cancer, I believe there is one other antibody drug conjugate that's kind of in later stages of development, which is sacituzumab govitecan, which is in development by Immunomedics. It's got a different target than enfortumab. Enfortumab targets Nectin-4, while sacituzumab targets Trop-2, but it's actually being tested in a very similar population in an ongoing phase 2 trial. So I think results of sacituzumab's trial should be out in mid-2019. So if positive, that could end up being a kind of direct competitor to enfortumab in this space. And I also think to the second part of your question, the development of ADCs in general, I think has expanded quite a bit with approval of drugs like Tecentriq and Kadcyla and Responsa. So I think as the experience with these types of drugs continues to increase, I think their development will also continue to increase across a number of different indications.
Thanks very much.
Any other questions on that one? I guess I can move on to the next product, which is Tecentriq. And I actually wanted to highlight two key catalysts for Tecentriq that are coming up. The PDUFA dates for the drug's regulatory filings in both first-line triple-negative breast cancer and first-line small cell lung cancer are both in early March. And Tecentriq will probably be the first immunotherapy approved for triple-negative breast cancer. And this is based on the positive results of the IMpassion 130 trial. And in this trial, the drug showed a 9.5-month improvement in overall survival when added to treatment with Abraxane. But this was in the PD-L1 positive triple-negative breast cancer population, so worth it to note that. Tecentriq did have a 3.7, I believe it was, months improvement in the overall survival in the broader population, but this particular result wasn't found to be statistically significant. But even when it's limited to the PD-L1 population, the uptake of Tecentriq, if it should get approved, should be relatively strong, given that there aren't any targeted treatments approved for triple-negative breast cancer in the U.S. at the moment. And in regards to small cell lung cancer, the benefits of adding Tecentriq to chemotherapy were a little bit smaller in magnitude when you compare it to what was seen in triple-negative breast cancer. But they're still seen as clinically relevant, given small cell lung cancer has been historically really hard to treat. In the IMpower 133 trial, when added to chemotherapy, Tecentriq showed a 2-month improvement in overall survival. In terms of other products available for small cell lung cancer, Opdivo, another PD-1 inhibitor, was approved for small cell lung cancer earlier in 2018. But that was an accelerated approval for the third-line setting rather than the first-line setting, which Tecentriq is going after. And in addition to that, Opdivo failed to show statistically significant survival results in 2 subsequent phase 3 trials. So similar to triple-negative breast cancer, I think Tecentriq should see rapid uptake if it does end up getting approved for small cell lung cancer. And if we take a look at the PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors as a class, we can see that Keytruda and Opdivo have done the best by far in terms of the revenues, and you can see their quarterly earnings from 2015 through 2018 in the graph at the bottom of that slide there. But much of the success of Opdivo and Keytruda can be attributed to specifically the number of indications that they're approved for. I think Opdivo is approved for 9 different diseases, while Keytruda is approved for 10 different diseases, in addition to a tumor-agnostic indication. So these drugs have been kind of first to market for a lot of large indications like melanoma, non-small cell lung cancer, and RCC, and it's given them quite a bit of a market advantage over other drugs in this class. And if we compare that to Tecentriq, It's only approved for bladder cancer and non-small cell lung cancer at the moment. But I think these approvals, although it won't allow Tecentriq to fully catch up to Keytruda and Opdivo, it should allow Tecentriq to kind of make some ground up between these two drugs, especially given that the unmet need within these two indications is so high. But any questions on Tecentriq before we move on?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, is there any data to suggest that Tecentriq or Opdivo would perform better in small cell lung cancer patients who have PD-L1 positive disease?
Yeah, so that's definitely an interesting question, and I think it's primarily interesting because of the biomarker strategy that each of these companies developing a checkpoint inhibitor is taking. They seem to be slightly different. So, for example, for Tecentriq, if we look at the journal publication for the IMpower 133 trial in the first-line setting, it says that PD-L1 testing was not done during the trial due to expected high rates of inadequate samples, the expected low prevalence of PD-L1 expression on tumor cells, and the lack of association between PD-L1 status and response in Tecentriq's earlier trials. But within that trial, they did stratify by tumor mutational burden, and it showed that patients with greater than 16 mutations per megabase saw a larger improvement in overall survival than patients with less than 16. And if we take a look at another example in Opdivo, it followed a similar trend based off of early phase results where patients with high tumor mutational burdens who were treated with Opdivo monotherapy had 21% response rate, whereas low tumor mutational burden patients only had 5%. And then if we look at kind of the flip side of things, looking at Keytruda, a lot of its early phase results were split by PD-L1 status, and it did show a significant difference in terms of PD-L1 positive patients having an overall survival response of 14.9 months to Keytruda monotherapy, whereas PD-L1 negative patients only had an overall survival of 5.9. So quite a big difference in the PD-L1 status. I think one thing to note there is that the Tecentriq trial was testing the drug in combination with chemotherapy, and based off of kind of historical trials, PD-L1 status has less of a bearing on outcomes when the PD-1 inhibitors are being tested in combination with chemotherapy rather than alone. So it could be that different settings have different biomarker strategies that are optimal, but I think given the kind of results of IMpower 133, the companies will probably go for approval in the broader population if the trial's found to be statistically significant rather than targeting specific subsegmentations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Ooh. And we'll go through this one last catalyst here super quick, which is Cyramza. And Eli Lilly has filed for Cyramza in second-line HCC based off of a phase 3 trial. So Cyramza's initial trial in HCC actually failed to meet statistical significance in terms of overall survival, but some sub-analyses showed that there was a response in patients with high alpha-fetoprotein levels. And so they conducted a secondary trial, which was REACH2, specifically in high AFP patients. And the study met both PFS and OS endpoints. And while it was a pretty small benefit shown in terms of both endpoints, patients with high AFP concentrations are known to have a poor prognosis from the get-go. So this improvement is still seen as clinically relevant. And despite the fact that I think there's 5 new drugs approved over the last 2 years for HCC, there's definitely still a need for more treatment options, especially previously treated patients. And as we can see from the KOL quote below, that Cyramza's unique target population, as well as its higher tolerability in comparison to TKIs, could allow it to become a preferred option, especially for high AFP patients in the second-line setting. But any quick questions on Cyramza before we close out here?
Sure, just one final question from me. Are there any studies that are investigating checkpoint inhibitors in combination with TKIs in HCC?
Yeah, there are actually. So Lenvima is being studied in combination with, I think, both Opdivo and Keytruda in early phase studies, and I think Keytruda is also being tested alongside Stivarga in a phase 1 study. But I think so far the only checkpoint inhibitor TKI combination that's been progressed to phase 3 is the combination of Cabometyx and Tecentriq, which is being studied in the Cosmic 312 trial. The primary completion date of that trial I don't think is till 2020, but there's a good amount of excitement about this kind of a combination, specifically because of the outcomes that have been seen in a similar indication in RCC. So just kind of purely due to the positive outlook of those combinations and in other indications, I think there's a good amount of excitement in HCC as well.
Cool, thanks, Hardik.
With that, I'll pass it back to you, Dominique.
Great. Thanks, Hardik. So that wraps up our first quarter outlook webinar for 2019. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us today. We hope you found this helpful and informative. As a reminder, if you submitted questions through this webcast, we'll be collecting and answering them by email. Otherwise, you can also submit questions after the webinar at the email address shown on the screen, pharma@informa.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Also, just another reminder that we will be sending out the slides and recording to you and anyone who registered for this webinar for your reference. Thanks, everyone.